The lessons in his book apply in the Western world generally. And also this book here.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I really thank Nick for having me. And, you know, I have been traveling around a lot in the last, really about 2 years now. And what I'm finding as I go both in the United States, Canada, abroad, New Zealand, etc., there's a real desire from many people in societies to really find a different way. I really think societies are searching for a better way, and that this today is part of that search. So it's so great to be here. What we're going to look at is, since we're talking about psychosis, is what is history and science telling us about how antipsychotics affect people over the long term? Not just sort of short-term symptom suppression, but what are we seeing about how it affects people's lives in the long term? And once we have that information, does that provide a rationale for a new paradigm of care? As in 1998, the U.S. Surgeon General in the United States, David Satcher, put together a 400-page report on mental health. And he says, prior to the arrival of chlorpromazine, we lacked treatments to prevent them from becoming chronically ill. And then we got this vast array of treatments that are safe and effective. So again, there's this common belief system. Antipsychotics are a great leap forward. At least in the United States now, the minute someone is psychotic, they get hit with antipsychotics, and then the thought is you need to be on these drugs for life. And that's the paradigm of care that works in the United States. And I bet in the UK it's somewhat similar, right? Antipsychotics right away. All right, so what we're going to do now is look at the language that is used by those who believe in this wisdom to support in their own idea why this is a good use of antipsychotics. And beginning around 1992, we were talking about, Bob and I were wondering about this, we were talking about the arrival of what's called evidence-based medicine. And throughout medicine, they said we have to have evidence for what we do. So the first thing we want to do is look at what is the evidence for both the short-term and long-term use of antipsychotics, because there is such evidence. Now, the short-term use is really easy to understand. Going back to the 1960s, there would be people who would come into emergency room. They would run studies like this. People come into emergency rooms with, quote, psychotic symptoms. Half would be randomized to drug, half would be randomized to placebo, and at the end of 6 weeks, they would say, who's doing better? Who has a greater diminishment of psychotic symptoms? And with some great regularity, the people with the drug-treated group, or at least as the symptoms were quantified and scored, were doing better. It's not, now the difference is not nearly as profound as you might think in these studies, but there is a difference. And this is why the drugs are seen as having a short-term efficacy. They knock down the symptoms of psychosis better than placebo over the short term. Okay, so we go back to the 1960s. You start giving patients these drugs, and then the next question is what? How long should we keep people on these drugs, right? It's an obvious question to ask. And to answer that question, they ran studies designed like this. They would take that group of people who were good responders to antipsychotics. Now, if you have 100 people come in, treated with antipsychotics, a year later, only about 40% are in fact still stable on the drugs. They haven't relapsed. So they would run studies in that group, that 40% that were good responders, and the studies were designed like this. Half would be maintained on the drug, half would be abruptly withdrawn from the drug, and with great regularity, this group, those who were withdrawn from the drug, relapsed at a higher rate. Relapse meaning the psychotic symptoms came back and they would have to be rehospitalized. So what did doctors see? Doctors said, aha, you take away the drug, quote, the disease returns, and therefore we need to keep people on these drugs indefinitely. Now those studies were begun and done in the 1960s, 1970s. There's been many such relapse studies, and that is the evidence base for long-term use. You run studies in good responders, you abruptly withdraw the drug from one group and they relapse at a greater rate. Okay? And that's it. And in fact, in 2002, there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. They said, okay, what is our evidence base for the use of antipsychotic drugs? And this is exactly what they said. Okay, since we're going to go on a little journey today, an intellectual journey, where we're going to question this whole sort of story of progress, then the next question for us is, well, is there anything missing from this evidence base? And there's really two things here. The relapse studies, do they tell us anything about how well people are functioning? Do they tell us whether people are employed? Are they socializing? Are they enjoying their lives? What those relapse studies just tell us is that once you're on the drug, don't come off fast, right? You're at high risk of relapse. But it doesn't tell us how people are functioning. And it also doesn't tell us this. Imagine we do a study where we have people come in to the emergency room, first time. We treat half with drug, We treat the other half with psychosocial care, and now we follow them for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So we have over here the course of medicated, quote, schizophrenia, and over here we have the course of unmedicated schizophrenia, but treated with psychosocial care. Do we know what that course is? Does the relapse literature tell us anything about what is sort of the natural course of schizophrenia? It doesn't, right? It just tells us, again, what happens is once you're on medication. So we're missing some understanding of what might be happening if we didn't medicate right away, but did provide psychosocial care. So that's the first missing link. The second missing link is this. You see these relapse studies, they were designed almost inevitably where the drug is abruptly withdrawn. People are on the drug and boom, it's taken away. Now there's a few gradual withdrawal studies out there, and you know what the length of gradual withdrawal is in these studies? A week. Every once in a while there's 2 weeks. Now, just anecdotally, with people experience, we know that that's still really rapid. And so what you're seeing in these relapse studies, a lot of this risk of relapse is due to the study design, in terms of how fast the drug was withdrawn. Now in 1996, there was someone from the University of California named Patricia Gilbert. She summarized all the relapse literature. She said, look at 66%, if we summarize it, 66% of people relapse when they're taken off their drugs. And then another famous person named Ross Baldessarini said, yeah, but he's from Harvard Medical School. He said, yeah, but those studies are abrupt withdrawal studies. Can we find any gradual studies and see what the relapse rate is? Now, what he had to find for gradual withdrawal studies were studies in which people had been on a depot injection, an injectable, where they had not then renewed that. And the idea is that drug left more slowly. That became his stand-in for gradual withdrawal studies. And in those studies, only 38% of people relapsed in the next 6 months. And they found that those who made it through that period had an excellent chance of remaining well indefinitely. The point of this is this. This literature is based on, I guess we're missing this all of a sudden. This literature is based on it. There's a real design flaw in the evidence base. And we don't really know what the long-term course of relapse is from these relapse studies. There's a really interesting slide right now. Anyway, but it's okay. I can talk you through this, all right? So, again, we're going to go on a journey here today. And just follow me in this thinking process. So we can now see that there's sort of some missing parts of that evidence base that is used to justify long-term outcomes. So the next thing we want to do as journalists, and I came at this as a journalist. I was a reporter for a long time, wrote for magazines, and actually was director of publications at Harvard Medical School for a long time. But that's my perspective on this. So my next question is there any literature out there, besides the relapse studies, that says, yes, this paradigm of care is improving the long-term course of schizophrenia, some other type of study? So I did that when I was writing this book, Anatomy of an Epidemic. And what I found was this. Examples, there was a psychiatrist named Emanuel Stipp. In 2002, he asked that very question. So this is basically the 50th year anniversary of the discovery of chlorpromazine. He says, okay, we've been doing this for 50 years. Here's his exact quotes. After 50 years of antipsychotics, are we able to answer the following simple question? He uses the word neuroleptics, but he's talking about antipsychotics. Are antipsychotics effective in treating schizophrenia? And then he says this. There is no compelling evidence on the matter when long-term is considered. So this researcher went out hoping to find that there's evidence out there where shifting outcomes for the better for people so diagnosed, and he says, we just don't have it. And then he says this. If we wish to base psychiatry on evidence-based medicine, that's the value that medicine has adopted, we run a genuine risk in taking a close look at what has long been considered fact. This was really important for me. What he's saying here is this. This is worthy of a new inquiry. To take a close look at what history and science can tell us about how antipsychotics shape long-term outcomes. And he's sort of saying, maybe we should be prepared to be surprised. Okay? All right, so now that's what we're going to do. This was like a green light for me. This is a legitimate inquiry to see what history and science can tell us. And now what we're going to do in the next 35 minutes, they figure out the electricity, is exactly that. So keep following me here. Now we're going to try to see, we see so that Emanuel Stipp said there's no evidence. But now I'm a journalist, I'm going to say, but is there evidence? The first thing I want to do is find out what sort of outcomes were they getting for schizophrenia patients prior to the drug's arrival. Okay, that's sort of the baseline. And then the hope is we're going to improve on that, right? So in 1956, the National Institute of Mental Health, which is our big federally funded agency that funds research into mental disorders, they held a conference. Chlorpromazine has arrived in asylum medicine. And it was a big conference, and they said, in essence, how are we going to know whether these drugs work? And they said, well, the first thing we have to do, what sort of outcomes were we getting in the past decade? And here was the surprise when I went back and looked at those conference proceedings. Our understanding is that prior to chlorpromazine, people couldn't get out of the hospital, right? They were chronic. And it was chlorpromazine that enabled people to live independent, or at least go out and live in the community. Not true. So if you look at the studies from 1945 to 1955 of first episode schizophrenia, so these are not a chronic population, but they just come in, you find two things. And these are the studies done in the United States. You find that within 12 to 18 months, 65–70% of the patients would be discharged. So the majority, in fact, would not be becoming sort of eternally hospitalized. And then if you followed up on those first episode cohorts 3 to 5 years later, you can see these two studies. These were the studies that the NIMH focused on, the top two, as representative of outcomes. 73% were living independently in the community. Now this is before we had social service money system to provide people with payments. These people are working. Employment rates are above 50% in the US. In fact, in the US, it was around 60%, and there was a study done at this time, around 1960, where the researchers were looking back at employment rates, and they were disappointed that employment rates were only 58%. I was going to say, boy, I wish we had 58% employment rates today. There was also a study done in England at this time. Now, there was a difference a little bit in diagnosis between the UK and the US at this time. The US had a broader definition of schizophrenia, so the UK was diagnosing it more narrowly, so their first episode cohort was, quote, a sicker population. They did the same thing, and here were their 5-year outcomes. 5 years later, 1/3 of their group was just no longer schizophrenic. And I'm using the language of the time, okay? And that meant their symptoms had gone away. Their voices, whatever it was that got them diagnosed, those symptoms had disappeared, and they had had a time of schizophrenia. They had had an episode of schizophrenia. There was another 20% that might still be symptomatic, but was working and out in the community. So more than half, in fact, were employed, etc. Now, have you heard in the UK this idea that schizophrenia outcomes go along a spectrum of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3? It's actually coming, I think, from this time. And what it meant was this. 1/3, 5 years later, will just had an episode of schizophrenia. Okay? And then there'll be another third that 5 years later is still symptomatic, but they're still functioning okay in the community. They can live independently in the community. And then there's another third that in fact is becoming chronically ill, and that's the third that stayed in the hospital. So when we say schizophrenia, people so diagnosed it's a chronic deteriorating disease, that's really coming from the chronic population, that initial third that really wasn't getting better. Okay? So that's our baseline. Now let's start following the research that starts telling us how we're affecting longer-term outcomes, okay? People diagnosed and treated with medications. So the first well-designed study of antipsychotics was done in the early 1960s. It was done by the NIMH. It had 4 arms. People come into a hospital. 3 of the groups were put on antipsychotic, and the reason they had 3 arms is they were doing 3 different antipsychotics, okay? And the 4th one was placebo. And at the end of 6 weeks, yeah, the drug-treated patients were doing better. And this was such a famous study. This was the moment, up until this moment, they called these drugs like chlorpromazine and all major tranquilizers. They were not known as antipsychotics initially. They were known as major tranquilizers. This study comes out, and the researchers said, these drugs are not just tranquilizers, they are anti-schizophrenic drugs. They are antipsychotic drugs. They're antidotes to a pathology, in essence. Very famous study. This is the moment they get this sort of antibiotic status. And the 6-week results are still cited in the evidence basis, for use of drugs. What nobody cites is the 1-year data. Because what happened during that 6 weeks, in fact, many of the placebo patients were getting better. Then they're discharged. They're followed for a year in the community, and something surprising shows up. At the end of 1 year, the rehospitalization rates in the drug-treated group were higher than the placebo group. So right at this very early moment in the long-term outcomes literature, you see this vaguest hint of a paradox. Drugs that by their own standards are effective over the short term are they possibly increasing the chronicity over the long term, increasing the relapse rate? Now it's just the vaguest hint, but this is the first time we're looking at what's happening to people beyond 6 weeks, but as long as a year. We'll move to this in a second. I think I'm skipping through this literature pretty fast. The next thing actually I did in the book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, was look at clinicians' perceptions. Because clinicians at this time in the 1960s, of course, had some experience of working in the pre-1955 era, right, before they were medicated. And so I wanted to see, what did doctors say about what was going on with these drugs when they arrived? And you'll find this. Clinicians are saying, boy, my patients are getting better faster. But boy, are they coming back to the hospital. And drugs. And they even, this is when you see this phrase appear in the literature. The revolving door syndrome, you've heard this? It comes after chlorpromazine is introduced, and they say, boy, our patients are revolving in and out of these hospitals. That was one thing you see in clinicians. The second thing you see in clinicians is they say this. The other thing we're noticing is that when people relapse on drug, the relapses now tend to be more severe than they used to be. And then they said, and third, if you're on drug and you abruptly come off and you relapse, the symptoms tend to persist and intensify. So they're seeing a new course emerging in their drug-treated patients. So because of this, you're going to see some, in the 1970s, some revisiting at the NIMH, revisiting the question of the merits of these drugs. Now, one of the studies was done by Sanborn Bachhoven. He was a well-known psychiatrist at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, and he had data from a group of 1940 people, first episode cohort, treated in 1947 with psychosocial care but no drug, and he had followed that cohort for 5 years. And now he had similar data for a cohort treated in 1967, same hospital, also with psychosocial care, but plus drug. Okay? And so what did he report? What he reported was that the relapse rate was now higher in the 1967 cohort. You see it, it's not a lot. It's 45% to 31%. So in other words, the relapse rate was, it's really 55% against 69%. But the biggest thing is the functional outcomes. 76% were successfully living in the community at the end of 5 years in 47. And now he notices in 67, they're much more socially dependent than they were earlier. So what does he conclude? And I'll just let you read it from this retrospective study. Just take a minute to read his words. Okay? And you can see why he's making this conclusion. It's because his data on the social functioning is leading him to this conclusion, right? Okay, there were now 3 studies done in the 1970s that are going to be designed to revisit this question about the long-term merits of antipsychotics. There are very few longer-term studies in the literature. One was done by Maurice Rappaport at the University of California, San Francisco. And it was designed like this. People come into the hospital, and in the hospital, they're either treated with drug or no drug. It's not placebo. So when you say no drug, it's not placebo. That means nothing, all right? And then what happens is they're treated in a hospital, and then they're discharged and followed for 3 years. Now, in that follow-up period, people are free to go on and off drugs. It's naturalistic. So what no drug off means, no drug in the hospital, and they stayed off drug for all 3 years. The second one, antipsychotic off, means drug in the hospital, but people took themselves off. No drug on means no drug in the hospital, they go out, for whatever reason they go on, and you'll see that the last group is a group that's medication compliant throughout. So, there were 81 patients enrolled, 41 patients were treated without drug in the hospital. Now, of that group of 41, 24 never needed to go on drug. So they had their psychosis abate with basically psychosocial care, and then they did not need to go on drug in the following 3 years, and you'll see 2 things. Can you see this? It's a little hard with the sun. He's got two measurements here. One is the severity of illness at the end of 3 years. He's got a scale, goes from 1 to 7. You'll see the no drug off, it's really doing well on that scale. 1.7 on a scale from 1 to 7, and it's notably different than the other three groups, the drug-exposed group. And now look at the rehospitalization rate for the never drug-exposed, 8%. And now look for the rehospitalization rate for the drug-compliant group. Can you read that? 73%? So, what does he say? And I'm going to let you read this so you can hear in your own ears the words of the researchers. And the key here is this phrase, if one is interested in long-term clinical improvement. That's what's different here. The other studies are looking at short-term symptom suppression. The focus here is different, okay? But that's the key here on this one. Okay, the next, this is called the Open Paradigm Project. You see Soteria, Brighton, etc. This is what it's from. So in the 1970s, Lauren Mosher, who was the head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH, so he's the top schizophrenia doctor in the country, began questioning the use of the drugs. And so he designed a study that went like this. Patients come into an emergency room, and they're either going to be randomized to conventional care in the hospital, or they're going to be randomized to care in the Soteria house. And if they're going to be randomized to the Soteria arm, here's what happens. A woman about yay high, named Alma Men, and these are people, you know, quote, agitated, they're being brought to the hospital often forcefully, that sort of thing. Anyway, if they're randomized to the Soteria side of the equation, this woman named Alma Men would drive up in a little VW bug. She'd open the door and say, get in, and then they would go to the house. The point is, right away, there was a different sort of what was happening. The whole thing was, we're not in a sort of threatening environment, but right away was sort of a calming environment. They went to a house called the Soteria house. It was an old Victorian house. The idea was you would be with people. There would be staff there, and they might do yoga together. They would cook together. There wasn't so much emphasis on knocking down psychotic symptoms, but just having the person being able to live in this house and live sort of according to the rules, which was don't be violent was basically the rules. Try to help, etc. The house, by the way, if you actually are interested in setting up such a house here in Brighton, it was run by Boyce Hendricks. Boyce Hendricks was the cousin of Jimi Hendrix. And if you can lure him out of retirement, I would suggest you do so. He's an extraordinary human being. He's the sort of human being that when you're with him, he like, you feel special, is the only way to put it. He has this way of sort of being very warm, comforting, and somehow communicating to you that you're a really decent person. So I think when we talk about trying to set up a Soteria house, the staff is so important, and you can see that in Boyce Hendricks. And we're going to hear more about this, but I'll give you one little story that Boyce likes to describe about how they would treat people. So one of their people in the house early on, he had the delusion or the thought that there was a UFO that was going to land at a park at a certain time, and he was supposed to get on the spaceship, okay? So how did they treat that? Well, they said, okay, let's go meet the spaceship. So they went to the park at the appointed hour, they waited through the night, and lo and behold, the spaceship didn't arrive. So they got back in the car, went back to the house, and the guy turns to Boyce and goes, I guess they decided not to come. And you know what? That delusion began to abate. But that was their idea of how to treat, you know, these odd ideas, etc. But it was a research study, and it ran for 10 years. And these were actually the combined data from 10 years. They actually had then a replication house called the Emanon House, and they compared basically outcomes at the end of 2 years. You'll see, can you read this? Oh, sorry, there was one other design of this. When people come into the house, they would not put on, the Soteria part of the design, they would not put on antipsychotics right away. The idea was we're going to see if psychosis can abate. Benzodiazepines would be used, if necessary, to help people restore the sleep-wake cycle. The idea was to help people sleep. And then they would wait. And if people were getting better after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they wouldn't. They'd try to keep them off the meds. If they weren't getting better, they would put them on low doses of antipsychotics. And then they would be on that for a time. And then they would also see who could go off after a while. So it was a selective use model. Here's the outcomes. At the end of 2 years, the Soteria patients had better outcomes. You can read it: lower psychopathology scores, fewer readmissions, better global adjustment. And here's the medication use in this selected use model. At the end of 2 years, 42% had never been exposed to drug antipsychotics, 39% used them temporarily, and 19% used them continually. Now, we're also going to be talking about open dialogue today. Remember this selective use finding, okay? Watch what you see in the open dialogue model 30 years later in terms of sort of need for antipsychotics. Oh, by the way, one other finding I haven't put up here. Psychotic symptoms actually abated with this model of care at the end of 6 weeks, just as good in the Soteria patients as in the hospitalized patients. So it was actually short-term efficacy here too. Okay, again, I want you to read. Now remember, this is the head schizophrenia doctor in the country. He's done this experiment. So here's what he concludes. And again, you read it so you can hear in your own ears his voice. So you can see his conclusion, right? We need to re-examine the use of these drugs. We need to re-examine the thing of risks and benefits. And again, it's because he's looking at the longer-term outcomes, 2-year outcomes, etc. Head schizophrenia doctor in the country. Now, the third such study was done by in-house. I mean, the NIMH has its own hospital in Maryland. So this was a study done by the NIMH in its hospital, led by William Carpenter. William Carpenter today is still quite a famous, well-known psychiatrist in the United States. This study was not a randomized study. What happened is they had data of people treated in the hospital conventionally with antipsychotics and whatever other milieu therapy for 1 year. In other words, they had people come in, treated for a certain period of time, and they follow them up for 1 year. And now they're going to do the same thing, but they're not going to put people on drugs. Now, this actually is a no-drug thing. All right? Nobody's on drugs in the experimental arm. And a couple findings. The first one I think is quite surprising. The non-drug group actually was discharged sooner from the hospital. Okay? Second of all, you'll see that the relapse rate is again lower for the unmedicated group. It's not a lot, but it is lower. The most important thing is, I think, also this. The unmedicated group is suffering less from depression, blunted emotions, and retarded movements. These are basically side effects of the drugs. And now William Carpenter raises such a profound question. And think about this. What data does he have now as he's trying to make sense of the use of medications? He knows that the relapse studies show people relapse when they come off the drug, right? But now he has this other group of data showing higher relapse rates or higher chronicity with drug-treated patients. So how's he going to make sense of that? He raises this question. This first part is the relapse studies. There's no question that once they're on the medication, they're less vulnerable to relapse if maintained on the drugs. He's looking at that literature. But then he says this. What if these patients have never been treated with drugs to begin with? We raise the possibility that antipsychotic medication may make some patients more vulnerable to future relapse than would be the case in the normal course of the illness. Now, do you see why he's saying this? He's saying this because the higher relapse rates in the drug-treated arms of these 3 studies. And we're not talking about adverse events here. We're talking about the effect on the benefit side of the equation, the target symptom of psychosis. He's worried that we're making people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis than they would be because of the drugs. All right? Now, at this point, researchers from McGill University come up with an explanation for what's happening to explain this paradox. And it goes like this. A little bit of biology. How do neurons communicate in the brain? You have a presynaptic neuron, we call it a presynaptic neuron, that releases a chemical messenger, a molecule we call a chemical messenger, into the gap between neurons, which we call the synaptic cleft. And then that molecule binds with receptors on the receiving neuron, which is known as the postsynaptic neuron. And he says that molecule fits into the receptors like a key into a lock. You've heard that metaphor? And that's how messages get passed from one neuron to the second neuron. And dopamine is a very common molecule that's a neurotransmitter in the brain. So how do antipsychotics work? By this time they had discovered that antipsychotics work by blocking receptors, dopamine receptors on the receiving neuron. And at a therapeutic dose, they block about 70% of a particular type of dopamine receptor called the D2 receptor. And the way to envision this is, imagine you're pouring glue into that lock. Okay? Because you're pouring glue into that lock, the molecule can no longer fit in there, dopamine, and it can't open that lock. Does that make sense? And you're blocking about 70% of those D2 receptors. And by the way, there's three major sort of dopaminergic pathways in the brain, and one of the things you might see with Haldol and these drugs is slower movement. That's because one of the pathway goes to the basal ganglia, which controls movement, and you're basically slowing the passing of messages down that pathway. But the brain, they had come to understand, is this extraordinarily neuroplastic organ, and in response to this blockade, it goes through compensatory adaptations. And here's what happens. The drug is acting as a brake, right, on dopaminergic transmission. So the brain says, uh-oh, that's a problem. I got to maintain my normal functioning of these dopaminergic pathways. And in scientific terms, researchers says the brain is trying to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium. That's the scientific term. So how does it do that? The presynaptic neurons put out more dopamine than normal, okay? Now that compensatory mechanism seems to burn out after about 3 weeks to a month. The other compensatory mechanism is the receiving neurons, those postsynaptic neurons, increase their density of dopamine receptors. They increase their density of the D2 receptors. So what happens is, you go on a neuroleptic or an antipsychotic, it blocks your dopamine receptors, and now your brain in response creates new receptors. So once you go on the drug, you end up with about 50% more dopamine receptors than normal. Now there is some evidence, not that people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine activity, but for example, amphetamines. Amphetamines release dopamine, and you can have amphetamine-induced psychosis. So there's a sense that too much dopamine in the brain can cause, increase. And I'm not saying that people have a dopamine imbalance in schizophrenia. I'm just saying outside agents that cause a release of dopamine can cause psychosis or increase the risk. And what the researchers said is this. That's why the brain is becoming more vulnerable to psychosis. They now have a drug-induced dopamine supersensitivity. They have too many dopamine receptors. Okay, think about this. Drug acts as a brake, your brain puts down the accelerator, okay? This is the new homeostatic equilibrium. Now take away that drug. Take away that brake real quickly. What do you got down? The accelerator. This is why people are relapsing so frequently, they said, is because of this new sort of balance. But they said also, now just imagine you stay, and that's what they're saying here, and I'll talk about what they're talking about dyskinetic. But now also imagine you stay on that drug for a long time. They're still saying, you have these extra receptors, so that's your increased biological vulnerability, but you can also see why maybe that's going to put some stress on that dopaminergic system. And I like to joke, go ahead, when you leave here today, drive your car, put 1 foot on the brake, 1 foot on the accelerator, drive like that for 5 years, and see how well your car is running. But that's part of the problem. Okay, you can see this. They're saying that this is what's going on. There's a greater risk of relapse. Oh, one other thing. Yeah, this goes to this tardive psychosis. At this point, by the way, they were discovering that a lot of patients on antipsychotics and long-term developed something known as tardive dyskinesia. Have you all heard of this? Okay, what this is this. And the rate in the US was basically 5% per year. So after 1 year, 5% people had tardive dyskinesia. After 2 years, 10%. After 3 years, 15%. It was cumulative. And they were also finding that if you developed TD, even if you withdrew the drug, it often remained. Okay, what is TD? The symptoms might be seeing this. You might see like the tongue moving regularly like this. Or you might see other jerky tick movements, etc. People walking, etc. Well, what was happening is one of the dopaminergic pathways in the brain goes to the basal ganglia. This controls motor movement, right? And they were finding over time with tardive dyskinesia is that system was becoming dysfunctional. And because, in fact, you have these extra D2 receptors, basically these neurons are firing all the time, and so your tongue, instead of staying still, is like, it's because those neurons are firing all the time, okay? And there's done some more modern research, and the severity of tardive dyskinesia seems to correlate with the amount of the increase of D2 receptors. The more that upregulates, as they say, the more severity of the symptoms. But what they're saying is this, okay, we're getting some dysregulation in the system that goes to the basal ganglia. There's another system that goes to the limbic system, which is an area of the brain that is thought to, in fact, be a mediator of psychosis. And they said, if we're getting dysfunction into the basal ganglia, maybe we're going to get function in the limbic system long term, and that's going to lead to a more constant psychosis, basically a persistent chronic psychosis. So these two researchers from McGill University hypothesized this. This is Guy Chenard and Barry Jones, and then they studied their patients who had basically been on the drugs for an average of 10 years, and they found that 30% had signs of tardive psychosis. And what did they conclude? Read the last line. Oh, just read this. Again, this is their conclusion. So they're going to say, you're going to see in many people symptoms of greater severity, which of course psychiatrists and other physicians will say, see, the disease is getting worse. But they're actually saying what's really going on here is we have a drug-induced process that is causing this greater severity. Now, when they announced this in the early 1980s, imagine you're a group of psychiatrists, you all prescribe the drugs, and I'm Guy Chenard up here, or Barry Jones, and I say, hey, we've got this problem. We have these drugs that work over the short term. We insist that people take them on them, but there's evidence that we're actually making the disease worse. What do you say? If you're a doctor, what do you do? What's your response? The response was basically this, and excuse the cussing. You got to be fucking kidding me. They couldn't accept it in that sense. There are scenes of people standing up. Are you telling me that the drug I use to treat psychosis makes people worse over the long term? And you can see the cognitive dissonance. And people basically said, we're not going to talk about this. There was a famous doctor named Sullivan Snyder that said, okay, there was reason to worry about this. He ignores this research where they found 30%, and they said, no one's ever found any evidence of tardive psychosis, and we're going to put it aside. And basically in the early 1980s, this worry gets pushed to the fringes of the field. Now there's one team of investigators that has, in particular, has continued to sort of investigate it. It's Philip Seaman at the University of Toronto. Now you need to know that Philip Seaman, he was one of the researchers in the 1970s who put together an understanding of how antipsychotics act on the brain and how it causes an increase in D2 receptors. So this person has been at the forefront of this research for 40 years. Now he's developed an animal model for psychosis. Now, animal models of psychosis, I don't know how great they are. What is a psychotic rat like? But basically, it's an induction of certain movement and behaviors that he says is like psychosis. And now in his animal models, he's found different ways to induce this stereotypical behavior. He can do it with amphetamines. He can do it with angel dust. You call it angel dust? It's an illegal drug that's popular on the streets. He can do it with gene knockouts. He can do it with lesions to the brain. And these different ways, these different insults, he will say, all lead to this same type of behavior. Okay, and then he notices something odd. In every instance, the final thing he sees is an increase in D2 receptors. And he says these receptors also turn into what he calls a high state. And it's a sort of a vague concept, but it means that the receptor is really receptive to dopamine. It opens really easily. The lock does, okay? Think of a well-oiled lock. He says, this is the final pathway, okay? That's what you see in all this. Then he gives his rats antipsychotics, either the older drugs or the atypicals. And he looks at the D2 receptors. And he finds that the antipsychotics cause this very same thing. They cause a doubling of the density of D2 receptors that turn into a high state. So they cause the very same biological change that angel dust does, long term. Now in a sense, then he says, well, maybe this is why the drugs work and don't work. Okay? Now maybe when you go into a psychotic state, there is some sort of transient elevation of D2 receptors turning into a high state. He's not saying that there's necessarily that the system generally is like that, but when you have that break, that this is sort of a mechanism that enables psychosis. Now you give him a drug that blocks D2 receptors. Okay, maybe that's why the psychosis abates. He says, but the problem is, then these drugs cause a further elevation of D2 receptors, or a permanent one, and that's now all of a sudden you've made people more vulnerable to psychosis. So he does that experiment. He makes his rat psychotic with some of these other ways. He gives them the drugs. Their behavior, in fact, reverts to normal. They're not psychotic for a period. And then he can measure the drug-induced increase in D2 receptors, and he says, as that happens, the rats become psychotic again. So he says, this is why, his paper is sort of newly out. He says, this is why the drugs fail over time. Okay? So my point of this is, if we now look at this one line of research, we see that it arises because we've got this worry about the increased chronicity in the longer term studies. So it arises from clinical studies. Then people put together a biological explanation for it. Then you remember, actually there's one other thing I should have in here. Then we have the study of tardive psychosis. He identifies it also in his patients. Okay? And then we see the animal model. So you see that there's some coherency of the research around this worry. And by the way, this really was put aside for a long time, this worry about dopamine supersensitivity. But about 2 weeks ago, I was in Berlin talking to a session devoted to maybe problems with antipsychotics at the German Psychiatric Association, their annual conference. So I was invited by a German psychiatrist that wanted to sort of talk about this, and then they put together a panel to respond. And the German psychiatrist who invited said, "You're going to get clobbered. They're just going to have the cleavers out for you." I didn't get clobbered. Instead, the very person that was very high said, "Oh yeah, dopamine supersensitivity, it's a problem." And by the end of that session, and the person who invited me, this person named Volkmar Adderhall, was just shocked. They were talking about we need to use the lowest dose possible, and in fact, maybe we do need to get people off. So I'm just telling you, this dopamine supersensitivity problem is now it is coming back as a worry, partly because of the animal research of Philip Seaman. Okay, now let's go forward. So we saw one thread of worry that arises in the medical literature. And now let's see what other data is out there that tells us maybe how antipsychotics shape long-term outcomes. The next thing we can look at is MRI studies. So we get MRI technology in the 1990s, and we can use this now to measure brain volumes over time. Okay? And one of the things that researchers do is they take a group of macaque monkeys. You know, these are these big monkeys. Do you know what they are? They're quite big monkeys. I sort of feel like they're not sure they should be giving antipsychotics to monkeys, but anyway. They give them to a group of monkeys, and they give them both the older drugs and the newer drugs. And then, and this is actually not an MRI study. This is just, they're going to weigh the brains. So they're going to have some group of macaque monkeys that aren't put on the drugs, the other that are. They're going to give them a therapeutic, those that are put on, they're going to give a, quote, therapeutic dose for their body weight for 2 years. They're going to sacrifice them, and then they're going to weigh their brains. And they notice that the monkeys' brains of those exposed to antipsychotics now weigh about 10% less than those who weren't exposed. So there's some sign that maybe you're causing some shrinkage of the brain over time with these drugs. Now the best such study done in humans is done by Nancy Andreasen that looks at brain volumes over time. Nancy Andreasen is the former editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry for 12 years. So again, this is someone who comes from mainstream American medicine. She wrote a book called The Broken Brain. She's a believer in biological psychiatry. And her study is like this. She gets 500 people diagnosed with schizophrenia into her study. That's a large number of people. And she's going to just study their brain volumes over time, okay, with MRI. She's going to use MRI to measure brain volumes at the beginning, and then 5 years later, 10 years later, etc. Now, her theory, when she begins this study, is schizophrenia is a neurodegenerative disease characterized by brain volume loss over time. Okay, so she's expecting to see a decline, or that's her hypothesis, in brain volumes, but she's going to say it's a disease process. Okay, that's her hypothesis. She begins this in the early 1990s, and by 2003, she's reporting that she's seeing a decline in brain volumes over time, and schizophrenia is a progressive neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by progressive reduction in frontal white matter volume. Okay, you're losing some brain tissue. Then, having identified that there's this shrinkage, she says, let's look what happens to symptoms as this happens. And she says, as you get this shrinkage, you're getting a worsening of the emotional lethargy, that withdrawal. You're getting some increased functional impairment, and you're getting some cognitive decline as well. She's saying this is a disease process, okay? This is what happens over time. But you see she has a problem, okay? The animal studies are showing it's happening in healthy monkeys. So is this shrinkage in these patients, is it due to the disease or the drug, or maybe both? So she looked at that, and here's what she reported in 2011. She reported that it indeed was drug-related. Use of the old drugs, the new drugs, clozapine, are all associated with smaller brain tissue volumes. Both white and gray matter. Severity of illness and substance abuse had minimal or no effect on brain volumes. Now, I think if you asked her today, when this came out, it really rocked the world of psychiatry. And you can see why, right? Because think about this. Drug comes in, it causes a morphological change, shrinkage, and as that shrinkage happens, you're actually getting a worsening of negative symptoms, functional impairment, cognitive impairment. That really rocked the world. Although that part of worsening of symptoms was basically hidden. I think if you ask Nancy Andreasen today, she says there's still some brain tissue loss as part of a disease process, and these drugs seem to exacerbate that. One thing here is there's been 3 MRI studies, and one of the persons who did this research is Joanne Moncrief. She's a UK psychiatrist. She looked through all the literature, and they looked for all the MRI studies that studied brain volumes, and they said, can we find any of schizophrenia patients that have never been exposed to antipsychotics? Amazingly, they found 3. I don't know where they found these. I really don't. But in those 3, there was no significant difference in brain volumes between the schizophrenia patients and the normal controls. So it raises the question, maybe it's all drug-related. Now, I need to pause here for a moment. And I really should have done this at the beginning. You know, I know this for people who maybe have been taking these medications or have friends who take them, family members. I know this can be really upsetting data, and I'm sorry about that, first of all. I actually don't like to present this data in a certain sense. But I do believe if we're going to make thoughtful use of these medications, we need to know all the data. So in terms of sort of putting information out that I think we should discuss, that's what I'm doing. But I know it's upsetting. The other thing I do want to say is, when I give these talks, nobody should take this as medical advice, okay? For anybody individually or whatever. That's a different story. This is information that I think society needs to know when, on the whole, prescribers think about how to use these medications, okay? So if anybody's on these medications, please do not make any decision based on this, you know? And obviously there is a lot of evidence that coming off is really risky, perilous. I'll let her read this. I've never seen a quote like this in a newspaper before. I think she must have been tipsy or something, because she let down her guard with a New York Times reporter. She's confessing, know what it does. Causes the prefrontal cortex to slowly atrophy. So she sort of confessed that. Just so you know, I didn't introduce this slide, but there was a recent study published by European researchers. They looked at 43 brain imaging studies that studied brain volumes, and they concluded, yeah, it's clear that there's much more brain volume loss in the medicated patients. So this is becoming pretty well known that there is some brain shrinkage. Again, that actually happened, was acknowledged at the German Congress. What isn't acknowledged, I'll tell you, is does it associate with a worsening of symptoms, even though that's what Andreasen reported. Okay? All right, the next bit of evidence, I've got to hurry up here, don't I? Okay, WHO cross-cultural studies. There have been studies done by the World Health Organization that compared outcomes in the US and 6 other rich countries with outcomes in 3 poor countries, or developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria. One study was 2 years, one study was 5 years. Each time they concluded that outcomes for the schizophrenia patients were much better in the poor countries of the world, in India, Colombia, and Nigeria. You see this second one, being in a developed country is a strong predictor of not attaining a complete remission. This was the line that actually got me interested 10 years ago or 12 years ago. Why should living in a country be a strong predictor you have a poor outcome? And you can see they had a very good social outcome in the poor countries. Now, after the first such study, they asked They hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is the patients are more medication compliant. That makes sense. If you believe medications are so essential, you expect compliance to lead to better outcomes. So they looked at medication usage, and they found that in the poor countries, only 16% of patients were regularly maintained on the drugs. They were used. The drugs were used acutely, but then they didn't maintain them on the drugs, where, of course, that's the standard of care. So at least in these cross-cultural studies, you see better outcomes where they're not keeping all their patients on the drugs, and then they went back and looked at those cohorts of patients, the actual patients. How were they doing 15, 20 years later? And in those countries where patients weren't initially put on or maintained on drugs, look at this. Much better functioning, but 53% were never psychotic anymore. 73% were employed. We have a new cross-cultural study. It was done by Eli Lilly, 11,000 patients in 37 countries. The difference in this study is everybody's kept on drug for 3 years. So we've removed that medication variable. Now, here's something interesting. These are actually really good control of clinical symptoms. I've actually never seen it quite this high, this first column. That's really good control of symptoms. But look at the functional outcomes. So North Africa and Middle East, that's part of the old developing world. Look at the functional outcomes. They used to enjoy a very good social outcome, right? Not so much anymore. How about Latin America? Not so much. East Asia? Not so much. So in other words, in terms of functional outcomes, which used to be so dramatically different, they've now equalized. But it's not that our outcomes have improved, it's that their outcomes have dropped in terms of functional outcomes. And in fact, this study is now being cited to say, oh, those original WHO studies are wrong, because in fact, patients in poor countries do just as poorly as patients in our country. But the difference is that's using the Western model of care. Okay, I've sort of set up this. I've set up dueling histories, right? We have the traditional understanding, these antipsychotics made this great leap forward. They're absolutely essential to care. You need to use antipsychotics right away. You need to keep people on those drugs. And anybody who suggests otherwise is sort of a fool. But I presented another body of history, right, of science, that suggests quite something different. A much more nuanced story. Drugs that are effective over the short term, but long term are really causing some problems in terms of function and on psychosis. Now we have one study, one prospective study in the literature that basically looks at how do long-term patients fare off drug compared to those who stay on drug. It was done by Martin Harrow at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. It started in the early 1990s. It was funded by the NIH, and the purpose was what happens to people go off their drug, antipsychotics. We believe they're probably going to end up homeless, psychotic, they're going to have terrible outcomes, and this is going to document it, okay? Study goes like this. He enrolls 200 psychotic patients into his study. It's from 2 Chicago area hospitals, one public, one private, because he wants to get a racial diversity and he also wants to get a class diversity. Everybody treated with drug in the hospital, then they're discharged, and he's just going to follow them up at 2 years, 4.5, 7.5, 10 and 15 years, 20 years. He's going to look at how they're doing, and he's going to look at, as a part of how they're doing, he's going to look at are they employed in and out of the hospital. He's going to look at whether or not they're taking antipsychotic medication. Okay? At the end of 15 years, oh, by the way, if the conventional history is true, we should see the medication-compliant patients doing the best. If the story of science that I've been telling is predictive, we're going to see something quite different, right? Because they're really dueling scientific stories. It's a very young group, by the way, and at the end of 15 years, he has 145 of his 200 patients still in the study, and he has 64 diagnosed with schizophrenia, 81 with milder psychotic disorders. Okay, the results. Recovery. At the end of basically 2 years, 25 of his 64 patients had taken themselves off their antipsychotics. You would not see this today, but in the 1980s, there was a lot more chance for people to go off their meds. There wasn't as much pressure once they left the hospital. Now, the key thing is, in order to be in recovery, you had to be working or in school more than 50% of the time and have pretty good social function. It's not just a diminishment of psychotic symptoms. There's a functional outcome. Okay, at the end of 2 years, 21% are in recovery in the off-med group versus 7%. Now, notice what happens between year 2 and 4.5. Look at the off-med group. There's a lot of healing that goes on, right? Such that by the end of 4.5 years, the recovery rate is basically 40% versus 6%. 8 times higher. That stays that way for the rest of the 15 years. Here's what's key. Do the relapse studies tell you anything about this possibility of healing between year 2 and 4.5? It doesn't capture that, right? Those are those withdrawal studies. This is telling you some healing that doesn't show up in the withdrawal studies. So 8 times higher, this is just the outcomes on a global measurement scale of all patients. Again, you see the divergence happens between 2 and 4 and 5 years, stays that way. At the end of 15 years, he has 3 spectrums of outcomes. He has recovered, or in recovery, so-so, uniformly poor. You'll see in the on medication group, or let's start with the off, 40% recovered, 44% so-so, 16% uniformly poor. The on medication group, it's 5%, 46, 49. You see the difference? It's not just the recovery rate so much lower, there's so much of a higher percentage of people in the uniformly poor category in the group that stayed on meds. Remember the dopamine supersensitivity worry? The worry is that these drugs will make people more psychotic over the long term. And you'll see at the 10-year and the 15-year follow-up, look at the percentage that are still psychotic, having psychotic symptoms at the time. 80% for those on drug, 23% for those off. In other words, the psychotic symptoms have abated in the majority. You can see the 15-year data. This is consistent with the dopamine supersensitivity worry. This now is his 20-year data, and in some ways I think this is one of the most revealing charts. Remember, these drugs are supposed to be tranquilizers, right? It's supposed to make you feel calmer. What did they see? At the end of 2 years, there's actually a little bit more percentage of people off drug that are feeling highly anxious. Then between year 2 and 4.5, during this period when you see the healing, those off drugs, the percentage that are now feeling highly anxious drops to 15%. It goes up for those on drug. That is a huge difference, 70% to 15%. Now, what Harrow is worried about is you're seeing signs of tardive akathisia developing. Do you know what akathisia is? Akathisia is a side effect where you feel this internal agitation, and you just feel like you can't sit still. People describe it like, imagine the nails on a bulletin board, but imagine that multiplied 100-fold. And it's very much associated with suicide and violence. And he's worried that you're getting some persistent tardive akathisia settling in, where people are anxious in this uncomfortable way constantly. And you'll see that this stays throughout the study. Cognitive function, remember we said that the drugs with the MRI studies are signs of maybe some cognitive impairment. Indeed, those off medication had better cognitive function at every follow-up. Okay, relapse once patients are stable. What does this study mean? Let's imagine it's the 7-5-year follow-up. We look at all those patients off medication who are stable. They're not psychotic, okay? And now we follow them at the 10-year mark, and we say, of those group that was stable at 5 years, how many have relapsed by the end of 10 years? In the off-medication group, 0. In other words, once they got stable, they stayed stable. How about, so now we're going to follow the 7.5-year group. None relapsed at 10 years. Now let's look at 15 years. How many of that group that was stable at 7.5 years and in 10 years relapses then? 0. So the group that got stable by 7.5 years and off meds, there was a very low relapse. But you'll see that even among those who were stable on drug, 33% relapsed in that follow-up. And now let's take the stable period of those still stable at 10 years, 67% relapsed between year 10 and 15. This also is consistent with the dopamine supersensitivity worry. And it completely belies the idea that relapse rates are necessarily higher in those off meds. And what it tells us is, yeah, there's a lot of relapse rate when you come off meds. No question about it. Very perilous time. But if you can get stable, there's some chance of being stable long term. And Nick's going, would you end this damn thing? 5 more minutes, okay. The other thing he looked at people who got off their medications by year 2 and then stayed off for the next 18 years. And then he looked at those who were medication compliant. And he found that those who got off by year 2, 87% had 2 or more sustained periods of recovery, meaning they were working. By the way, the employment rate in the off-medication group was above 50%. Among those who were medication compliant, only 17% had even one period of employment. 87 versus 17. Now why? It's employment. Those medicated just weren't working much. Okay? And that may have to do with your motivation, etc. Real quickly, he had good prognosis patients, schizophrenia patients. Those in that subset, those who got off did better than the good prognosis on. He had bad prognosis patients. Those who got off did better than bad prognosis on. Here's what he concluded. How many of you have heard about this study? How many have heard this conclusion? Longest running prospective study we have. Here's what he told the American Psychiatric Association in 2008. Here was his conclusion. Here's the milder patients. Again, those off did better. By the way, these are really good long-term outcomes. More than 50% of those with milder disorders, in fact, got off. Again, this is back in the 80s. You wouldn't see this today. You see this score. So best outcomes is 1, 2. The cumulative score for those off antipsychotics was like 2.5. Really good. And here's a really key study. He ends up with 4 groups, right? I mean, data point. Schizophrenia on and off, milder disorders on and off. Okay, what's the best group? Milder disorders off. Next group in global outcome scores is schizophrenia off, then milder disorders on, schizophrenia on. So why is this chart so problematic? It's because schizophrenia had a worse initial prognosis than milder disorders, right? And yet, schizophrenia off ended up better than milder on. Now, I don't know how to explain that unless the drugs are iatrogenic over the long term. Unless they're worse than the course. And think about this. The bottom two, those are the ones not following medical orders. Those are the non-compliant patients. The top two are the ones that followed standard of care. And all I can say is we can discuss this study, but you need to know this so we can have an artful discussion. And it also means when some patients say, I want to go off the drugs, maybe they have good reason. It raises this question. I just want to show this. This is, if you can read this, this is a recent editorial from Peter Tyler, editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry. Look what they're saying in the British Journal of Psychiatry. Now, when I sort of began, when my book was Anatomy of, well, there's 2 parts of this. Anatomy of America was published in 2002. There was some of this data in it, and basically was like, you got to be kidding me. This guy's biased, it's crazy, whatever. Then I published it in 2007, got a lot, in 2010, Anatomy of an Epidemic was published, a lot of criticism. It was like heresy to be saying this, and now you have this, 2010. Time to rethink the use of these drugs. These drugs may be such, simply not worth the candle. This is coming from mainstream psychiatry. All right, I'm going to stop now, because you're going to hear about open dialogue, Soteria. But think of this idea as we go ahead. What do you learn from this literature? For sort of a best use principle. I think there's 2 things you learn from this history. One, when you talk about that initial moment of psychosis, can you do something to help people get through it without putting them on the medications so their brains don't have this compensatory adaptation? And the literature tells us there's going to be a group that's going to get through it, right? And that group's going to have a good outcome. Not everybody, but there'll be a group. And then you're going to have another group that in fact probably does need to have some use of antipsychotics, stabilize whatever, after a period of time. And then after people stabilize on those, hopefully, you're going to want another moment of dividing line in your paradigm. And you're going to see who can go off long term and who needs to stay on. So you're going to have a selective use model around 2 principles. With initial use, don't try to put people on, try to get them through the episode, maybe use benzos, and then try to minimize long-term use. And the beauty of this story is that's what Northern Finland began doing in 1992. It's called open dialogue therapy, which is what you're going to hear about. That's the medication protocol they adopted, and they now have, by far, the best outcomes in the Western world. And you can see that their use of antipsychotics is actually very much an evidence-based use of antipsychotics because there's this long history of literature behind it. And what I really like about the open dialogue principle is this too. It's not an anti-medication protocol. There's nothing ideological against the use of medications. They believe they're useful. But they have figured out a model that looks around for whom, basically when, for whom, and for how long. And that's very different than our one-size-fits-all and basically take your drugs for life model. So it's not an anti-medication model. It's really a how do you use this tool for the best advantage of all people. And that's really what you're going to hear today going forward is models that have a new paradigm of care. It's called the open paradigm. But you can see there's a lot of science behind rethinking our current paradigm and coming up with a new paradigm of care. So thank you. There's even this, as you know, listen, psychiatry has sort of been threatened by a lot of its own literature. This is their literature, right? This is stuff done by the NIMH. It's not like coming from critics, etc. Because a lot of times they feel quite threatened by their own findings. One of the things, especially in the United States, and it also is coming out of Australia, the idea was that untreated psychosis is damaging to the brain. And actually, they said if you don't treat psychosis, you get brain shrinkage. And you know where that data came from? It's really fascinating. They did studies where they put people on either Haldol or Zyprexa. And what they found is, in the Haldol treated group, there was more shrinkage at the end of, like, let's say 16 weeks than in the Zyprexa group. And there was very little shrinkage in the Zyprexa group. So they said, they argued in their minds this: the disease shrinks the brain. Okay? Haldol doesn't stop that shrinkage. Zyprexa does. It's neuroprotective. Okay? And that's the way they thought. They said, oh, you got to put them on Zyprexa right away. Now that study was funded by Eli Lilly, the maker of Zyprexa. And now, but they've done a study looking at brain shrinkage in Zyprexa and Haldol long term, and guess what? By the end of the year, the Zyprexa patients have caught up in their brain shrinkage. It's just that it happens at a different rate. So that's the first where that came from. The second thing about untreated psychosis, there's a sense that people who are better connected to society get into treatment earlier. It's often college kids that get in, etc. And when they do trace those outcomes of those college kids who get into treatment versus those who end up getting picked off the streets, now both end up getting put on drugs, okay? It's just, the idea is one group is getting put on drugs faster, and 5 years later, maybe they have better outcomes. By the way, by 10 years, it seems no difference. That's where that data is coming from. It's not coming from where people are in treatment giving psychosocial care. So, but where are the best outcomes in the Western world? Open dialogue. Do they get people early in treatment? Yes. That's different. It's not to stop a brain disease process. It's because when people stay out of treatment for a long time, that you can have a real breaking of social bonds. People can become socially isolated and their sense of self can really begin to deteriorate in terms of their capacity to function in society. So one of the things open dialogue has done is they are really cutting short the period of untreated psychosis, but their treatment is not antipsychotics right away. It's psychosocial care. So the answer to your question is, do I think untreated psychosis is bad? Yes, I do. I think people can become progressively isolated, and things can happen in terms of their sense of self, family, etc. What they do in the open dialogue idea is we got to build back these social connections. We got to bring them back up into where they can be with other people, family members, friends. And we got to have them have a sense of self, restore a sense of self where they see themselves as able to integrate and see themselves as having a future. That's the treatment. I think that's great. And actually their outcomes are getting better with early treatment. So, is untreated psychosis a problem? Yes. But is it a problem because there's a disease process, or is it because there's a social disintegration process? I'm pretty sure it's the latter. So, should you get people into treatment early? Absolutely. Then the question is, what treatment?
Next question, gentleman here.
Yeah, just
There's a microphone coming.
there's a question about the Harrow studies you were showing, but I was just interested, between the on and off medication groups, were there any other group differences, you know, in terms of class, abuse histories, those kind of variables?
Yeah, so the Martin Harrow study, you know, and again, it's not a randomized study, okay? It's naturalistic. Everybody treated in and people are going on and on. Now, if you read the first study, this is sort of getting what you're going into. He says it was those with a good prognosis that were more likely to go off. So he actually says in the beginning, it's not the drugs aren't the problem. There's a natural selection process. There's some people with a better internal sense of self. Those are the ones who are going off, and those are the ones having the better outcomes. So it's not a class thing exactly, but he's saying that there's this internal prognosis, people who have an internal sense of self, some sense of ambition. Now I think that probably is a predictor of, that is a good thing to still have, right? But it's not the explanation for his data. Because his data, and basically the story behind this is this. Martin Harrow was told, don't publish this data. It's bad for psychiatry. And literally the discussion, I think, is being spun to protect the image of the drugs. And I said to him, I interviewed him, I said, you said it's just a matter of the good prognosis patients going off, it's not the drugs are the problem. Okay? And if you read anatomy, you'll see that I quote him saying that. So that's not what your data shows. Within the good prognosis group, those who got off did better than those who stayed on. Within the bad prognosis group, those who got off did better than those on. In the milder disorders group, those who got off did better than those on. And then finally I said to him, how do you explain that the schizophrenia off did better than the milder on? Because that's crossing what you'd expect. And at this point, he got very furious with me. And he said, you know, you're the most naive person because, listen, this is threatening the psychiatry. I was told not to publish this. I'm worried about my research funds. Did that chart I showed you with the 4 outcomes? The data's in there, but I put together the chart. So he has the data, but he actually does not make the conclusion. It's just in his data. And I said, well, am I wrong? And he said, no. The point of this is this, going to your thing here. Clearly, class can make a difference. Options can make a difference. What past people have can make a difference. What sort of trauma they can have can make a difference. He's not looking at that. At least he hadn't been. He's got a grant from this foundation that formed in response to Anatomy of an Epidemic, this nonprofit formed. It's called the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. It's raised about $3 million to fund research into they're funding open dialogue replication projects in the US, but they're also funding, they're giving Martin Harrow some money to really drill down into his own data, and maybe this is what will come out in some of his own data. Because it's in the research protocol. Different classes of hospitals, racial, all that's in there, and the question is, will he publish it, which would be quite interesting.
You mentioned Joanna Moncrieff, who has, in my mind, written one of the most important books on this subject that I have read during recent years, called The Myth of the Chemical Cure. And she seems to have made a very, very crucial distinction between 2 sets of paradigms. One which she calls the disease-centered model, and the other which she calls the medication-centered model. And she makes a very good case for at least putting in a big parenthesis or dismissing altogether the disease-centered model, since for 200 years now we have tried to find the diseases and not been able to locate them. But we do have the possibility to correlate what happens in people's lives when they are on different sorts of drugs. So this seems to be a much more fruitful way to study the problem. And that's a whole different paradigm, isn't it? I know from where I come from that when, for instance, people are put on going through a set of electroshock treatments, if they get better, it is because of the treatment, they say. If they get worse, it's because of the illness.
Well, yeah. First of all, that is actually, you do see this sort of cognition happening among the practitioners. So they will attribute improvement to the drug, and anything that goes bad is the illness.
Right.
Which sort of protects their sort of belief system, obviously. We can understand this. Anyway, the book he's talking about, there's a UK psychiatrist, Joanna Moncrieff, very good book. She's the one who did that research about looking at the long-term volumes with MRI studies. And one of the things, the myth of the chemical cure is this idea that these fixed chemical imbalances, it's just not so. So for example, we hear that depression is due to low serotonin, but they didn't find that people with depression, before being medicated, had low serotonin. We hear that schizophrenia is due to overactive dopamine systems, a lesion in the dopamine system. But when they looked at schizophrenia, people so diagnosed prior to being medicated, they didn't find that they had overactive dopamine systems as a matter of course. So that's what she means, the myth of the chemical cure, that these are like insulin for diabetes. And as part of her thinking is this: we got to stop thinking about these drugs that are like insulin for diabetes, that they're curing something, that they're treating a known etiology. But we consider these drugs as sort of tonics. Do you know what I mean by a tonic? Like a sedative, or like a stimulant can be a tonic as well. And then if you consider them as tonics, but not as cures, then you think about when you need to use them. When do you need to try and help someone go to sleep, a sedative or a stimulant, that sort of thing. And what she's saying, I think, is in this other model, you would use the drugs very differently if you conceptualize them as tonics, as in fact tranquilizers. Like a benzo will make you feel tranquil, at least in the beginning. Long term, not so much. But that's how we should be conceiving of drugs. And I think it's a scientifically accurate one. And also, if you did it, you might use the drugs much more selectively and thoughtfully. So it's a good book. It's a really good book. And she's a UK psychiatrist. I don't know where she's based. But London.
What does your research say about the effects of lithium on the brain and advice from professionals about, in terms of if you wanted to discontinue, the effect of it is either on or off, so reducing it gradually doesn't make so much of an effect. What's going on in the brain?
Well, I have no idea what's going on in the brain of lithium, and no one does, as far as I can tell. Lithium has this long history, it's basically toxic at a certain dose, and so the idea is you have to have a non-toxic dose, which is going to be hard to do. I will tell you this. When lithium was introduced, sort of as the magic bullet for manic depressive illness, and that was the thought. Rehospitalization rates for manic depressive illness, and this is research done in the UK, increased. Why did they increase? Because many people didn't like to be on lithium. They stopped taking the lithium, and the risk of the time of period to relapse. So let's say you have a diagnosis of manic depressive illness, and you look at what happened in the pre-lithium era. So it goes like this. People would get their manic episode would pass, or their depressive episode would pass, and then if you follow them out, there would be this course. About 50% of patients initially hospitalized for manic depressive illness would never be rehospitalized. Okay? They would have had a time of manic depressive illness, they would have recovered and not had anything, at least so notable they had to be rehospitalized for manic depressive illness. Then there'd be another group that would have this. They'd have the hospitalization, they'd get released, they would recover to what is known as euthymia, an absence of symptoms. And then you'd see some people like, I think it was like 3-4 years later, having their next episode. Such that over the course of 15 years, you might see 2 to 3 episodes. So we have 50% no rehospitalization. We have another 30% with, there's sort of 2 or 3 episodes over 15 years. And then there would be about 20% that would be have much more frequent hospitalizations. What they noticed with lithium was the period between episodes dramatically shortened. So you had a lot more cycling. And the risk of relapse, if you came off the drug as opposed to never been on the drugs, was something like 7 times higher. So what they saw is, lithium's pretty good at controlling mania if you can stay on it. But if you don't, you're at extraordinarily high risk of relapse when you come off. I don't know so much about the studies on gradual withdrawal studies. Or I do know abrupt withdrawal, you see all sorts of relapse. And this again, Joanne Moncrief did some of this work, looking at the longer-term course of bipolar, and just not finding that with lithium we were improving the long-term course. And in fact, by the early 1980s, researchers were saying the course of bipolar is changing to much more frequent episodes, much more rapid cycling. And what they were saying was happening was people were going on the lithium, but there was only about 20% of really good responders to lithium that really both stabilized, number one, could tolerate it physically, and 3, also found it acceptable emotionally, because some people found it sedating and tranquilizing. So because of that, what happens, you take 100 people with lithium, what they found is a lot of people stop. Once exposed, there's a lot of relapse. Okay? And if there's 2, even people on lithium, there's a lot of relapse. there is, looks like a core group of about 20% of people who stabilize well on lithium, seem to tolerate it and do okay on it. But anyway, the short and sweet answer to your question is there a lot of increased risk of relapse coming off lithium? Yes.
To ask you about the, I'd like to ask you about the reduction in good outcomes of the 15 to 20 years in the final part of your slide, the off-meds people who are having a problem between 15 and 20 years. Because there seems to be, off-meds people, lots of improvement, kind of stabilising with improvement, and then a sudden kind of decline of 15 to 20 years.
I don't think there's a sudden decline.
Oh, well, a decline, or an increase in relapse. And all I wanted to say is that it's exactly my experience.
Oh, okay.
I was 10 years medicated, very compliant, kicked it, 10 years without meds. And it was, and now I'm like 12 or 13 years without meds now. But it's been in the last 2 or 3 years where I've been re-experiencing all sorts of very difficult psychotic symptoms. Continued to stay without meds, had a crisis house, women-owned crisis house to go to. And what's very exciting for me is what you're showing me is that this is common. And my interpretation is that after this 12-year process of living without medication, I'm now mentally and physically strong enough to deal with the root causes of abuse, neglect, and very severe traumas that occurred in my very early life. And to me, this drop is part of the healing process. And I want you to hear that because I think it's important, because it might be something that you're not sure about how to present. But to me, it's very important that people understand that, my experience, and I believe a lot of other people with men who've experienced massive trauma in their early lives, do need to experience the psychosis, not to the point of self-harm, but there is a process that can involve, and has involved in my experience, learning the symptoms, learning the management, learning the process, and with support fed the way through that. And very briefly, one other point is the breakdown between bipolar and schizophrenia. They're the same. I'm sorry, you just said 50%, 30%, 20%. You said that both for bipolar and schizophrenia. To my experience, it is the same illness, just with a different label, and it has a very similar, if not exactly the same cause, which is abuse, trauma, body memories that can't be processed by the mind. Thank you.
And that's well known in the literature. The thing about manic depressive illness and schizophrenia, there's a really interesting story behind that. And you got to go back to Emil Kraepelin, and it's revealing. So Emil Kraepelin is the great German psychiatrist, great, that's his title in history of psychiatry. He's the one who gets us the separation between manic depressive illness and schizophrenia. And so he gets a group of his psychotic patients coming into the hospital, and he now follows them for 10 years, or whatever, the length of time. And he notices they segregate into 2 sort of outcomes. He has one group of patients, which he's going to name as dementia praecox patients. They deteriorate, okay? They don't do well. And he has this other group of psychotic patients that does well, pretty benign, but they're psychotic. These are all psychotic patients. Now the difference is this. The dementia praecox patients, it turns out, when they show up at the hospital, have an extreme lack of affect, lack of emotional engagement. They also have trouble making willed movements. So they actually have some tics. And in fact, if you go back to this time, people were having, in the early 1900s, difficulty distinguishing between dementia praecox patients, Parkinson's patients, because they looked like they had Parkinsonian symptoms. Then, in 1916, a viral infection called encephalitis lethargica was discovered. And guess what? Encephalitis lethargica patients, once they isolated that virus, they looked exactly like the dementia praecox patients. So actually, if we go back to this early time when we were distinguishing manic depressive, and so then what happened to the schizophrenia diagnosis? So schizophrenia, dementia praecox used to be for those people who show up psychotic, but with having trouble making willed movements, okay? And extreme lack of affect. But now we discover the encephalitis lethargica virus, and now we take those pool of patients from the dementia praecox group. What's left? Well, now they changed the conception of schizophrenia. And what happens now, going forward, is just psychotic symptoms now starts to become seen as schizophrenic. And we say, oh, dementia praecox patients, they deteriorate. But that's a different group of patients. That's patients that Kreplin was seeing that deteriorated. I think many of them did, in fact, have encephalized lethargic. Again, you want to read a great book on this? It's by Mary Boyle. She's a psychologist in the UK. Really brilliant story about sort of the evolution of the concept of schizophrenia. So actually, there's two things. Manic depressive illness, as defined by Kreplin, was that people experiencing psychosis, but showing some emotional engagement, some depression, some mania, that sort of thing, some affect. And what did Kreplin find with those patients? They got better. So psychosis with emotion got better. That's most of your early psychotic patients, right? So if we go back to Kreplin, who would have diagnosed them with manic depressive illness, they were going to get better. And in this distinction that was once made, it's actually a lot of note for optimism for people becoming psychotic today. Because psychosis itself was not seen as that problematic.
Psychiatrists are not trusted by their patients. I never trusted a psychiatrist all the way through my career in the system. And actually, I voiced her, but I had the voice telling me this is a very dangerous place. Do not tell them about me. Do not tell them what you're experiencing. And my belief is that there are more patients self-restraining information than psychiatrists will ever want to believe. And that's part of the reason why they've been able to perpetuate. And the important thing here is that as a bipolar patient, I was given actually fairly lightweight drugs. If I had spoken about my voices, I would have been given the heavy-duty antipsychotics, and I would not have been able to take myself off meds. I would not have been able to manage my health in the same way, because I would have had more of these long-term clinical, physical effects.
I do think there's a different conception here that actually is very revealing and sort of helpful. So I went up there to write about this for Anatomy of an Epidemic, and I asked about the conception of psychosis, and they say, psychosis is not something that happens in the head of a person, but it happens in the in-between spaces of people. And once you have that conception, you have to heal those in-between spaces, which means you sort of have to heal the social web.
Today is when we're all when we're well associated within ourselves, when we're well associated with others. And to be able to do that ever, on any day, to the degree that we as a society have come to think of as being normal or expected or desirable, when you think about it, is miraculous. That anybody should be able to be as aware as we've come to assume and expect ourselves and others to be ever, to be aware and integrated and associated and functional, and both conscious of what's going on in our heads and other people's heads, and other people's heads around the world. To think that we can hold that together ever at one time, and we do, is a miracle. And when somebody isn't doing that, it's scary, because it's not part of what we need. You know, we've come as beings, as human beings, to depend on the perspectives of others, to be able to rely on other people watching our back, or at least being able, when we have a thought or a feeling, that what it means to have what we describe as mind implies that what we're thinking, we expect somebody else might also understand or agree with or support, or at least be able to relate to well enough to tell us if we're wrong. And when we're not able to do that, that sense of mind is broken. And so what we hope for, how did I figure out over lunch to say this? We've come to expect this miracle of interrelatedness and inner being, interdependence, inter-thought. We depend on it. It is essential to the human experience. And it is what we call mind. And I think that when we talk about, if we think about, people talk about the mind-brain question. And I think I figured that one out too. I mean, the brain, we each have one brain, but none of us has one mind. Mind doesn't exist in the sense of we each have one of them. That what I'm trying to say is that mind isn't something that it's any one person's to lose. Mind is the sense of that we are connected with others, that we can depend on how other people think and feel, that when we can feel safe and functional and at home in the group with which we live, we have our minds. And when we lose that, we've lost our minds. And I'm saying it's not the mind, the concept of mind is something that is not any one person's to lose. And that's one of the things that got me into doing this work, is I started realizing that the people I really admired, who really contributed amazing things to the world and to my life, were people that would often, would frighten others if they knew the whole story or everything they dealt with. And I started to feel obliged. I knew that I was lucky in everything that I had and experienced and been able to do in my life. I knew it was luck. The fact that I, at certain times, didn't end up in a hospital, but ended up instead in school. Sheer luck. So what I'm saying, I think schizophrenia is, it's a misnomer to think of it as a divided mind that exists within one person. Schizo means we are divided, but we're divided from other people. And mind is something that we all share. So I'm saying that schizophrenia is when we're all divided. And what open dialogue does is it creates a space in which that sense of shared mind can arise and come into existence, and in which we can experience something that we have come to take for granted, which is in fact a miracle. And to not do, whether it's in a family or a business or a community, what open dialogue has demonstrated, and the only thing that open dialogue has done is it's just simply demonstrated yet again that any time you make that kind of space, whether it's in an Indian healing circle, any culture that, I was just in one of those actually in New Mexico last week. Cultures create these spaces in which we can say we don't know together how to, just that we're all together, that the future's coming, we don't know what's coming in it, and we can do it together. So I guess that's the opposite of schizophrenia, is a collective mind.